Okay. So, welcome to the Virtual Café for the Anti-Corruption in Business Perspectives and Practices. And we have with us today Joy Famador, who is with MICA in the Philippines. And she also sits on the Global Integrity Network Executive Committee, where we plan a number of webinars. There is one on corruption and culture on Monday, and then there is one on perspectives of corruption in business. And then another date that you may want to mark down is December 9th. That's the Global Anti-Corruption Day, where we have different speakers. And that's on a Thursday, also at the same time. And you're welcome to join us on that. And if you put your email in the chat room, I will make sure that you get added to this little subgroup. So Joy, thank you for joining us. Thank you for staying up late in the Philippines. And so please give an introduction to who you are, what you do, and then the rest of us, we can be ready to ask her any questions. She has a lot of experience, and we look forward to the discussion we will have. So Joy, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Willie, and good evening from the Philippines. I have worked with an anti-corruption group for, say, 13 years already with an NGO, but I resigned last year. It was called Christian Convergence for Good Governance. It started as, in terms of approach, it started in filing cases against alleged corrupt officials, and then later it evolved into voter education because the board at that time was reflecting on why are we going to file a case against a corrupt official if we can prevent it by installing a not corrupt official. So that's how it evolved. But before I worked as in an NGO, I used to work with government, from different levels of government, the local level, office of the mayor, and then at the national level, I also work with office of the senator and then office of the president of the Philippines. So what I am sharing with you, if you have read the paper, were really more of stories based on what I have seen and experienced, and stories because the executive committee of Global Integrity Network also thought that it's also good to have stories and more practical things that we can share, aside from going into theological discussion. So by way of review, let me share with you the PowerPoint, but briefly, Can you see the PowerPoint now?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay, let me see. Because sometimes...
Oh, no. Okay, here it comes.
Okay, here it comes, finally. The internet is a bit slow, but I think we can manage with this. Okay. Our action usually is defined by the way we perceive, or sometimes with influenced by our belief system. So one of the things that I have noticed is that a lot of people in my country think that nothing can be done about corruption. There is the spirit of helplessness and the spirit of hopelessness for quite some time now. So the more we discuss about it, among pastors particularly, I realized that fighting corruption is also an issue of faith, you know, and therefore we need people of conviction. I have seen that a lot of the ministers I have talked with, they tend to believe more about God's transforming power in other aspects like evangelism. But when it comes to social transformation, they seem to be just limited more on the four walls of the church. So that's one dominant perspective that there's nothing we can do about corruption. The other one, although I have shared, I keep on sharing to them that one step at a time in our simple ways, we can really stop corruption. It has to start with us. No? So I have shared different stories of people as individuals, how they stop corruption in their own way. So corruption may start with us unintentionally, but it can also stop with us. Another perspective is about fighting corruption is not a ministry priority. This one is very also common among church ministers. They would think that we don't have time for the ministry and corruption, that they think that it is a program. And I keep on reminding them that this is not about, it's more than just a program, but it is a requirement of God, the character that God demands from us. So if God is a God of integrity, faithful in his words and action, then we have to also follow for what he is. And this can be counteracted by discipleship and it can be integrated in a ministry. This is distinctly an approach of the church and therefore it can easily be integrated. It's not a separate ministry, but it can be integrated with our sermon. Once the church will teach continually about integrity, honesty in their sermon, Bible study. So it's not really a separate ministry now. It's an integral thing. Perspective number three is corruption is just about stealing money. So this also is very common. And what I'm saying is that corruption is not just about stealing money. You can steal time. If you're a government employee, you don't report on time, you don't render, say, an equivalent of 8 hours, that's part of stealing. Resources of government, for instance, which can be directed somewhere else, is part of corruption. For a government official to make a decision which is prejudicial to the interest of the public, that is also corruption. So it's also trying to deepen, no, the understanding about corruption. So if we have Christians who are working in government, we have to remind them to work with excellence and observes work ethics. So it also contributes to the prevention of corruption in government. Because if we render service without due diligence, that's really falling short to what is expected of us. So these are the more common perspectives I have encountered as we have done advocacy work, in different sectors. So what are the practical ways of addressing corruption as a group? I haven't shared this last time, but I'd like to share this, the different strategies in addressing corruption. Because corruption is such a very complex issue, there are many ways to address it. It can be multiple, at the same time. Some only uh, some organizations focus on only one. For example, if we talk about rule of law related to integrity, One approach is formulation of laws, no, or legislation. In the process of implementing programs in government, and there are a lot of issues that emerge. They find that there are some loopholes in government laws. So the Congress might formulate laws, or it can be initiated by the people. Another approach is through sanctions, no? From the perspective of the civil society, we can assist in case build up, and sometimes that would take years, gathering some evidences to something that can really hold um, in the court of law. So we can assist in case build up, but we can also directly file legal action, which we had an experience. And of course, for government, they have a law. There is a law on about the code of conduct for government officials. And I think even this type of approach applies in the business sector, even in education, that we come up with code of conduct for our own members to prevent corruption, hopefully to prevent corruption. Another approach of addressing corruption is systems reform, better financial system. I find that here in the Philippines, in very small churches, particularly the independent churches, the lack of financial management system became a vulnerability to corruption. Without them really intending it, there's no accountability system, the lack of transparency. So, and that will also apply even to a bigger organization like and Christian NGO, who the board very trusting in the way the board just keep on signing blank checks with all the trust for the executive director, and eventually it became vulnerability and corruption occurred. Better IT for administration, if at the local level, for instance, if right now there has been a development of using technology in issuing receipts. So that means you cannot tamper it. No, it lessens the vulnerability in fighting corruption, issuing receipts in government transaction, for instance. And then independence and externality, including it. Is there a credible auditor to edit a separate government agency? And we have that kind of system in the Philippines. Transparency and accountability, the aspect of transparency, accountability, if we want to address corruption. So, as civil society, we can engage in advocacy and awareness raising. No? We can go into anti-corruption education, and this really covers a lot of things like studying laws uh, on corruption in the country of our respective countries, and then studying the systems, how they operate, and then open and transparent procurement. This one is very common, although we have a law in our country about procurement, no law. There's still gaps as the civil society started to participate. We found some loopholes in the law, and of course we go back to um, proposing amendments to the law. But transparency in securing supplies, services for government is also a very big area where corruption occurs. Participatory monitoring and social accountability. There are a lot of tools in our country that we call it, it's like a grading system where people will be trained on how to use a form, and then we start to give a grade to the performance of government in different types of programs. So there is accountability. So we monitor the performance of government services. So that is promoting social accountability. And then information and use of data. For instance, we have this bill, freedom of information. So to promote transparency in government in all its transaction and its program implementation. So these are the different strategies in addressing corruption, and you will find that addressing corruption is so complex and it requires a lot of study and reflecting also. Uh, in a way, you also experiment what is the best approach that will work in a specific context. Now, practical ways of addressing corruption is a group. We wrote letters to government officials. We visited government offices, no, to report a corruption issue, but we made sure that it is backed by data. And then it is find it very helpful to join with other anti-corruption campaign, whether they are evangelical or non-evangelical groups. We joined I've shown this before. There was this caravan against pork barrel way back years. What year was that? 2013. So that's an example of joining with other groups. Other practical ways, as a church or parachurch, help in providing support to individuals who are direct witnesses to corrupt practices. Another one approach, practical approach, is undertake an integrity development seminar in your locality. So I think the question before, how do we start a program or a project on or a movement in fighting corruption? So it can be through a seminar which we did, and we let me share with you at the local level, how did we mobilize against corruption? So will this involve churches and community or people organization? So the first step was that we did some research. We came up with fact sheets, popularized materials, no, on corruption, and then we produced prayer guide for pastors. And then we developed, oh, sorry, sermon, sample sermon and Bible study material for churches. So we conduct seminars, you know, covering usually it's around 2 days. So different forms of corruption, what is the biblical perspective of corruption, um, and then trying to let them identify where they are vulnerable and come up with a plan of action. So at the end of the day, they will come up with more concrete action. So we can also monitor as an NGO whether there's a progress in our advocacy work. After a seminar, we identify who are really interested to be part of the anti-corruption campaign. So we identify the potential advocates, and then we train them on a deeper level. It can be an anti-corruption tool, you know, which takes around 2 days. So depending on their context and their preference, what kind of form of corruption they want to engage um, to address. So we try to offer a training that will match their interest. And then as they are equipped, we engage. They are engaged in community action through educating others. They start to write letters. They monitor government agency or project. And then they also network. We encourage them to network with other groups, no? Whether local, national, and international. So that's how we started and operated in mobilizing groups. Now, what briefly our lessons and insights in pursuing anti-corruption anti-corruption program, it is necessary that we study our own context, our culture, government structure, the processes and laws related to corruption. This is we find it very necessary because it helps define our strategies. The other one is to give focus for the first, I think, 3 years, we were just promoting or educating about corruption, why we should be engaged in corruption. But generally, we cannot track our impact if we are so broad in our advocacy. So we realize we need to give focus. What really is the type of corruption we want to address? Is it bribery? What about bribery? Is it bribery of police or traffic enforcers? So it also defines the type of advocacy that will work, no? Type of corruption. If we choose a government agency, which government agency? Is it a national agency or is it a local government? So it really helps, no? It will help us develop our indicators as well as our program outcomes. And one of our also lesson is to guard our own integrity. For us to be credible before people, I personally, as an advocate, also guard my integrity. And it helps very much to be more conscious about it and we give more authority, no? As we advocate about integrity in the fight against corruption. And another lesson that I had was to listen to God's voice. Make Jesus the foundation of your efforts and depend on God's sustaining grace. There are My experience was sometimes it's the funding organization that gives you push. They will push you. This is their framework, and then you try to adjust or integrate their framework. But in the process, when you're so busy with all the demands of the reports, I thought, wait a minute, I think I'm not listening to God's voice anymore. How come this is the kind of direction I am taking? That it really struck me. But I thank the Lord for He really speaks through His word and that He reminded me that an anti-corruption uh, program or advocacy, Jesus should be the foundation. And I'm really very serious about it. And when I realized that somewhere along the way I got lost, I have to go back, no, and make Jesus the foundation and to really depend on His sustaining grace because prayer is very important. Sometimes when we become so very busy, we pray less. We try to work on our own efforts. But one thing God showed me was I cannot do everything. The organization cannot do everything, and there are some areas which are beyond our reach. But through prayers, I have seen some situation in which God really answered prayer. So that's one of my personal lessons as an advocate on corruption. Yeah. So basically, that's the summary of what I have shared last time. And this is a time for us to share. I am very confident that each one of you has something very rich to share tonight. So I am here and we can start our dialogue. You can share your thoughts as well.
Yeah, so the easiest way is if you want to speak, just unmute yourself. We're not a huge crowd, but I think there's a lot of things that we learned. And so, Joy, thank you very much for the very practical advice. I have plenty of questions, but I always have questions. So I will turn it over to whoever wants to make some comments or even ask some more questions. Feel free to relate your experience.
Yes, if I may start,
Yes.
thank you very much, Joy, for such a wonderful presentation. When you spoke about lessons learned, and you mentioned quite clearly that one needs to study his or her own context. And I am looking at my African context here and culture, and I realized that there are some areas in which we need to be, I don't know which word I can use, but we need to be very, very careful, because culturally here, there is this issue of gift giving. And the gift giving thing here is really very, very complicated, because it goes back so many years ago during the days of, chiefs and leaders. You cannot go to visit a chief empty-handed, you see, or, going to visit a leader empty-handed. That does not apply at all. Generally speaking, it's a very good cultural thing. You give a gift and you'll also receive a gift. I don't know in your culture, but here this is a problem, because in that particular process or activity, that's where corruption flourishes. You see, corruption grows. And no one knows how much, for example, you have taken to the king or the chief or the senior or a leader. You don't know. So it could be maybe a piece of bread, but actually it could be a huge envelope, and that is corruption. So for me, thank you very much for that. Studying your own context, that is our challenge here. And we keep teaching, even within the church, gift giving can be something disastrous. So what is the situation in the Philippines?
Yeah, thank you for that, for raising that, no, because we had one time we had conversation with Christian politicians. So we had a very good sharing about gift giving, because our law, we have a law that does not allow government officials to accept gifts, no, particularly before. But like your country, we have uh, we have this culture also of giving gifts to our leaders. And then I asked I think he was a vice mayor at that time, and I said, "What was your experience about gift giving?" He said, "Well, you see, I'm a local executive in a small town, in a rural area. Usually, it is the practice of the people, once we harvest, plentiful harvest, we really share it to our neighbors. And that I find my constituents giving me the fruit of their labor, their harvest. We want to share, because that's part also of, expressing gratitude to God. You share your bounty to others. So in that context, I'm going to accept the vegetables, the fruit that are harvested, because I know them. They are my constituents.
Hmm.
However, there are some individuals who come to me who suddenly give me gifts. Then I start to discern, why is he giving me gifts? Is he Does he have an interest? You know? So I appreciated that kind of sharing, because
Hmm.
here is a person who respects the culture, but at the same time very conscious of what the law is. Now, there was this at the national level, we have a story of a senator. Apparently, he is a man of integrity. When he was appointed at the time of President Cory Aquino, appointed him, no, in a certain position, he stopped receiving gifts during Christmas, and all his friends were offended. What happened to you? We're friends. just because you are now a senator, you don't accept gifts to us anymore. So, you know, this is the interplay of the expectation. We are friends and we're not asking anything. And now you are, it becomes insulting. However, in the office of the ombudsman, I heard somebody told us, please don't give even a Christmas card. He will never open it because it is an envelope. The card is there. He will never open it. So there are some government officials who make some specific position on that. Uh, it has some consequences. Sometimes it's negative, but in the process, they are also respected. They become known that, that person um, will not accept anything. However, I heard that there has been a change because we were asking, what if it's your birthday? Some people very appreciate our service, especially if we are very efficient. Some people really give gifts out of appreciation. So I think there's now a new thing. I heard that the government allows to accept if the value is only say 100 pesos or 200 pesos, no, in an occasion if it is a birthday. So I think it's giving allowance to our culture of giving gifts. But I think there's really a thin line, no? If I am the one about to receive, I have to be discerning because our laws are much influenced by the West, no? And it's transplanted to us. We copy a lot of laws from the West, and yet our culture is different. So how do we balance these things? So I think that it's we share the same situation, no? So it's going to be a struggle.
Thank you.
So in light of that cultural perspective, so did the wise men try to bribe Jesus's family? They gave some very expensive gifts.
Is with the perfume.
Well, the other the other perspective is also is that, when is it God's provision and when is it to get your way? And in this case, for Jesus, Joseph and Mary, they had very little funds of their own, and they had to go over to Egypt. And so this was God's provision for them to survive in Egypt until Herod died. So, the context is very important. Melba, you've unmuted yourself. So I am assuming that you have some questions or comments.
Well, actually, I think there are two ways of looking at this. One is being realistic about human nature. Proverbs, for instance, tells us that a man makes his way smooth by the giving of gifts. In other words, whether you have ulterior motives or whether you're simply giving gifts, the fact is that it closes the social distance. In other words, there's a very thin line between making it as something that's a kind of bribe so that you get somebody to do something.
Yeah.
But also, I think it is human nature to recognize that when you're giving gifts to people, it tends to soften, whatever hostility, whatever opposition you might encounter from that person, at some point. So I am thinking of basically Oriental cultures, Philippines as well as Chinese especially. The Chinese like to give gifts. Filipinos like to give gifts also. And there are many reasons why we give gifts. One is, we call pasalubong when, you travel and you come and you bear all these gifts, from whatever place you come from, and you give it to your staff, you give it to people around you, and so on. What Joy has said about generosity, it's part of the culture that whatever you have, you'd like to share it, because Filipinos are, one of our psychologists who said that we share not just goods but also our identity. In other words, it's a sign that you belong to us and I belong to you. In other words, you're part of our sakop, Sakop it's that sphere where you recognize accountability and a shared, community. So if you are given gifts and you are part of this community, then you feel bound to give gifts to everybody who belongs to that community. And that's a good way of affirming people. In other words, it tells them you belong to us together. But of course, it's something else when you give gifts precisely because you want to make your way smooth, as as Proverbs tells us. And Chinese are very experts in this. Even if it is not yet immediate, they will ask you for a favor. They will start giving you gifts, and then at some point they start asking for favors. So in that way, of course, that's bad. But I don't think there's a one size fits all kind of way of looking at this. I mean, it always depends on context. It always depends on what Joy has said, discernment. I think we need to discern what is behind the gift.
Yeah. And the other thing also is, as believers, we're called to be generous. We're called to do that. But I love Joy's closing lines about walking in the Spirit and learning to hear what the Spirit has to say, because that makes a big difference. And I think one of the problems that we have, and Joy, your opening statement about, well, there's nothing we can do about corruption. And, you basically reminded us, yes, there's plenty of things that we can do, but it's all about hearing what God wants us to do about it. And, how can we make it happen? How can we do things with integrity? And, the other example is, what is your lifestyle? Is it based on integrity? So thank you for that perspective, Melba. Stein, I don't know if you have any comments. You usually have, so I will let you speak.
Oh yeah, thank you. There are so many thoughts, and this, to be honest, just 3 years ago, before I started this work, I knew nothing about corruption. I'm from a farm far away from people. No one talked about it. It's not a topic, and we have no words for the things that happen, but we don't talk about it. And then I start working in Digny, and I understand what's happening. I'm learning about it. I see the trouble it causes in Norway as well, but especially in the countries where we work. So. And then also you start to see the complexity of these questions. You have the business, and you have the government, and you have the civil society, and you have gifts, and there are all these aspects of internal control mechanisms, and the human mindset and biases. You know, I think of this all day long. How do we cope with corruption, and how do we fight it? So I'm very glad you have all the answers to this. Oh, frankly, I'm very thankful for you to share about this, because in my during my days, I know all the agreements, what our governments say. We have zero tolerance for corruption. You should handle it so and so and so. You should fight it this way, and you have to be build strong internal control functions. But it's not the only thing we need. We cannot control it within the box we have. We need to see many aspects of it, and the worst thing is that it doesn't affect me that much. It affects those people I work with. So actually, I had a seminary, 1-hour seminar about anti-corruption last week for 250 people from our countries in Africa and Asia, talking about this. And I spent weeks on preparing it, because those people I talk to, they are facing the trouble corruption causes. They lack food because of corruption. They do not get hospital places because of corruption. They do not have a taxation system that gives them the facilities that a government should give. And I'm sitting here and I don't face that trouble. I'm having my payment, and I'm having my friends, they don't face and act corrupt. And that's my when I was preparing this, I was thinking, okay, how do I meet this? I can speak 1 hour. It's very easy for me to speak 1 hour about all the different control mechanisms. We have partner assessment tools, we have risk mitigation strategies. We have so many tools, and the agreement is it's 5 pages of procurement provisions on how you should make procurement transparent and all these things. And I can speak for weeks about it, but then it's more than that. And while I was preparing, it's what I had to dig deep in myself. Why am I not acting corrupt? If I cannot answer that, I cannot speak about it. And I was like, we have the legislation which prohibits corruption in Norway, and as in many countries, and Joy also talks about this, it should be sanctioned. But that's not enough. People act corrupt anyways, because there are some, and we talk about these gifts especially. There are very thin lines. When is it okay? When is it not okay? When should we report it, and when should we not? So that's not enough just having legal regulations for corruption. And then I have the responsibility of being a human being. I do good to people. You know, I don't do corruption because I know that doing corruption causes harm any place in the world or close to me. And then I have the Bible. So I am responsible to God, right? And many people are. So we are like billions of Christians, but still we see in our churches, we support that corruption happens. And in the Church of Norway, corruption happens. We have the gifts trouble, and we have these things as well. So why I am not acting corrupt? It's like, it's because I don't need to. I think that that's kind of the hard answer. My friends, they don't. So I'm kind of secure there. So if all of my friends did corrupt acts, it would be very easy for me. But they don't, and it's not the culture in my area, at least, is that we don't do that because we don't need to, because our kids go to school without paying bribes, and we have a health system taking care of us. And I think it's hard for me to say, because this is about justice and everyone should have these services, but everyone doesn't. And we need to address these differences to talk about partnerships. And these are just many thoughts, but it's also something why I need to understand why I don't act corrupt, to understand why other people do. And this is more like a comment, and it's not any answer, and it's not a question. It's just there are so many thoughts, and I think we need awareness raising. First, when I started to know what corruption actually causes around, then I start to get interested in it. And I want to be a part of this fight together with you, and we need to face it, and we need to fight against it. And I was thinking, when you showed Joy, you had a page here of different strategies. No, local mobilization against corruption. And you talk about education, which is a part of it, because when you address something and when you educate people, you have made it known, and then you can discuss how many hours of anti-corruption do you need. Is it 11,000 or is it 900? You know, the quantification is not easy. But what I realize is that telling stories of when reducing corruption is a success, like you do here, you give some examples. I think that will help on reducing corruption. And I have one example from one of our churches. They focused during the last 5 years. They had a very high focus on transparency within the church management. And through this work, they realized that the offerings increased. Why? Because the church members, they saw that, oh, my management, they handle this transparent. So by telling these stories to other churches, we can inspire each other. And like you also do, you tell stories which inspires me to stay in this fight. So I think a part of, if you should have a fourth point on this, educate, it will be telling positive stories.
Mhm.
It's almost nothing, but it's something maybe.
Yeah, about sharing
Yeah.
stories. Yeah,
Mm.
Alfred first.
Okay, thank you. Yes, when Stein was speaking, I was very much touched, and especially when he spoke of you know, in his country systems are in place. And we are also trying, for example, here in Africa, and I'm glad that he was able to learn. And as soon as he began to talk about systems in place, then I equated what he said with what Joy talked about. They needed to educate and equip. And I'll give you an example of the things that are slowing us down in our context here. We have, for example, at our university, I'm coordinating a unity for the study of corruption. This is, they say, the only unit across higher learning institutions here in Tanzania that is responsible for that. So we have a great idea, but this particular unit is still very small and resources are limited. Now you see, how do you educate, how do you equip? While you have, say, for example, one data projector, which you need to use for 6 groups to equip, sometimes you feel like you are tired. You have only one laptop and someone is using his or her laptop. Resources, you see, we need resources, we need the systems, we need to understand the rule of law related to integrity. You know, we need transparency and accountability. So context, still a very, very powerful idea. And I feel very much encouraged by what you are actually saying. And, you know, it really touches me very much. The need is huge, but the capacity is limited. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to support your sharing about limited resources, because the organization that I work with had really very limited resources. You know, in a given year, $4,000 in a given year, $5,000, and I think the highest that we had was $10,000. So one time, I had my quiet time and I was looking at my budget, you know, and I said, Lord, what is this ministry that you're giving me? I only have 5,000 pesos, you know, at that very moment. So I prayed. And then in my quiet time, as I reflected on God's word that moment, it says there, knock and it shall be opened. Seek and you shall find. So I was thinking, okay, I'll start knocking at the door. So I went to World Vision and I said, oh, I like to know, this is a election season, no? So I said, I'd like to know whether you have a program on voter education. Because in our voter education, we included different forms of corruption during election. And then they said, oh, you have good materials and we are not ready for voter education. Can we contract you out, no, for your service? You operate in 9 regions of the country. So at that time, I didn't have anything to pay for the salary of the staff. But because of that project, I think we provided the salary of equivalent to 3 months for the staff. So I saw it like, if this is a ministry that God has given, He will provide. But it was a step by step. And then I did not limit, as executive director, I did not limit myself to the money itself, the finances. I start to network. So I started courting the executive directors of different NGOs. And I said, I have something to offer. So I was marketing our product. And then they would say, okay, trainers training. I will gather all my staff nationwide, bring it here in Manila, and then you conduct. And then they will be the one to cascade or to roll it out in the different parts of the country. So it multiplied. And I think that made the organization survive. Of course, there's sacrifice, no? There was sacrifice really on the part of the staff, but I have seen God really unfolding. That's why I said, if I will rely purely on funding, I would really miss those things. I even went to a province, small town, rural town, and the pastors didn't have the projector. They didn't have laptop. And you know, and then they said, we couldn't pay your professional fee. And I said, never mind about professional fee. If you can gather the people, can you provide, do you have 20 pesos? You know, because I didn't want to make it purely free. Just a token that they're interested. That was my first time to experience the seminar. When we have this big fish, I don't know if you know the tilapia. There were 13 trainers, pastors, and we shared all in one fish for our lunch. And I said, okay, this is solidarity in poverty, but it's more meaningful to them because they can link the cause of poverty is part of it is corruption. But I choose to sacrifice those things. Whatever you can give, I can give or share lessons through seminars. If you can gather them, let's work together. And that's how we operated. And the Lord, you know, it's like the offering of the boy to Jesus. How many loaves of bread and how many fish? And God will multiply. So it was really more of management by faith. It's not by sight. When we say management by objective, you know. So we start by faith and the Lord just paved way. But it's a lot of hard work because it's time consuming to network. So the organizations are the ones providing the resources. What I had was more of what I know and then share the knowledge. So They offer their facility. Some sponsor their food. And that's the way we survive in our advocacy so far. So I'd like to encourage you. At least there's one laptop and projector.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I like to pick on science sharing, like, you know, when things are so comfortable and you contrast your life and you
Yeah.
see more of what you see out there, and you see a
Yeah.
lot of countries really suffering because of corruption. It reminded me of my one time I attended the United Nations convention on against corruption. No, so they presented all the strategies of ODCAT. I couldn't relate because it was so, you know, it's so up there and it seems so distant. And I was thinking, how can I translate all those things and to make it understandable to local people? Because it was concerned at the international corruption level. It talks about of course, the hidden wealth and how it can be monitored at that time. I have to, you know, do research of a certain persona in the Philippine politics that Filipino ordinary people can understand and say, yeah, that general deposited the money to the Swiss bank, you know. So I can understand where you are coming from, because usually when you are in an international organization, you see things in a broader perspective. While me, as through CCGG, I tried to. It was more of a preference, a decision that we want to go local, because for me as an advocate, I will be strengthened and be more inspired if I see directly change in the lives of people. So that was our bias. But that's why when somebody tells me, oh, you are not known, your organization is not known, I said, yes, we are not known because we're working at the local level. But we tie up with national organization, because if the lives of the people at the local level will be threatened, you have a support advocates from the national and even international level. So we try to connect local information from our advocates going up to the national level, hopefully as a data for policy formulation, you know, for reporting about corruption. So it's an up and down dynamics. So that's what one of the things I learned, but I can understand that if you are in an international, especially say at the European level, you have a different context. And of course, like Africa and Asian countries, you know, we see more of the life itself. It's more tangible.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's also important to acknowledge that we need both. So we need governments need to talk together. Like, no, when I say government, I say the Norwegian government, like the bilateral discussions and unilateral. They need to work on this corruption and find out how can we address and how can we make responsibility and accountability and transparency in these relations, which is also a great part of corruption. You see the news every week where a president buys a private jet and these things, and where did the money got from, and corruption in Afghanistan, and there are so many aspects of that. So we need to work within our frames, and I have decided that I will maximize our effort within our frames. So it will not be, I can stand against corruption in the bilateral senses, but it doesn't, I need to work within my frames. And that's why I like this this hour, the hour we had here, because it's very specific, and I will use this because we strengthen civil society. That's our purpose. And how do we strengthen them? We need to address the problem of corruption, and how can they do it within their frames? They can write letters to their government. They can walk to the office and say, hey, what I saw yesterday and these things. So, and government is a great problem of the corruption trouble we see. The studies show, and we know, and you see, and you face this. So we need to support the civil society to stand up against corruption. And I feel more secure after this hour that we have some tools, and we will have to use them.
Yeah.
So thank you again.
And I am very grateful, Joy, the way that you started this off. You know, corruption wants us to think that there's no way that we can stop it, because that's what the enemy wants us to believe. And so often we're ready to give up when God says, no, I hate corruption. Do we really know how God feels about corruption? If you read scripture, he hates it. He hates it with a passion, because corruption is based on a transactional relationship, whereas God has called us into a covenantal relationship. And when everything is reduced to a transactional relationship, it's what I can get out of this deal. And so we have to remember that God's resources are infinite. And sometimes the only reason we want access to his infinite resources to better ourselves, when we are here to call to tend to the earth and to make a difference there. And, you know, like I have a hard time in terms of some places where I used to travel, and I've traveled to over 40, 45 countries during my career. When I know the government official who is stamping my passport has not been paid for 6 months, you know, how do you do that? And, you know, with Alfred, you know, one of the reputations that Tanzania has in terms of the development area, and I don't know, Stein, if this is your experience, but they are so good at finding all the loopholes to get all the money. They provide all the reports that is needed, and they don't do anything, and they get other people to lie for them. And, you know, and then when you help them out and you try to work something, next thing you know, if you don't do exactly what they say, they blackball you. You know, and you're trying to be corrupt, you're trying to be honest and build in integrity. So it's at all different levels. But I think, Joy, your comment about awareness, how do we do that? Can we feel the passion that God feels about corruption? Have we seen it? Maybe what we should be praying is to see what happens. And, you know, like I've been to Afghanistan and I've worked in Afghanistan, and I can tell you some of the dealings that I've had at the highest levels it's corruption that killed all that, you know, and so if you see the damage that it causes, we have to learn to hate it as much as God hates it.
Well, if I may maybe say something on why it's so very difficult. Number one is, you know, sociology talks about plausibility structures. In other words, we may have all the systems in place, the control system that Stein has been talking about, you know, and mitigating whatever risks there may be, etc. Now, it's very good to have those places, to have those mechanisms in place. At the same time, I think it's important to look at the economic context as well as the cultural context, as Alfred has already pointed out, because no matter what sort of mechanisms we put in place, if people don't experience, incentives and disincentives. In other words, the kind of monetary rewards that's important so that they don't buckle down to corruption. Um, so that's the economic side of it. I remember one of our officials who was heading the Bureau of Immigration, and she had a great deal of success in curbing corruption in that agency simply by incentivizing uh, those who would like to do more work, to do more sort of overtime work, and she increased the salaries and the fees for those people, and so the corruption dramatically decreased simply because the the structures were made plausible by the economic incentives. And then you also have the reality that culture often trumps structures. In other words, in our case in the Philippines, it's really the relationships around those structures that really make it work. So for instance, if going back to that idea of SACOP, because SACOP is our sphere of accountability and responsibility for each other. If I recognize you as part of that group that we call SACOP, where it can be a clan, can be a club, it can be a kind of society. So long as that is your SACOP, you recognize it as your sphere of responsibility as well as accountability, so that I will not do anything that will be offensive to the SACOP. In other words, my network of relationships. Because usually in our cultures, relationships are better than systems. And that's how governance works. I mean, for instance, even myself, when I'm stuck with some technicality, about, say, there's a media equipment that was donated to us, but we cannot get it out because you need to give grease money to the officials involved, even if we are supposed to be tax-free, as an organization. And they say, oh, even if you're tax-free, you cannot get those equipment out without, greasing everybody. But I said, we are Christians, and we are not going in any way to do that, In other words, and then I sort of asked, do we have a friend within that agency? It's second nature to me to ask, do we have friends in that agency who can help us? And usually, if you have a relationship within that agency, make all those relational connections, then you can get your things out, and it's second nature to most of us that we always ask, when the bureaucracy does not move, you ask, do you have a friend inside who can make things work? And this brings up the whole idea of relationships as actually much more powerful, at least in our cultures. Relationships are much more powerful. In other words, you don't like the SACOP as the sphere of accountability. You try not to do anything that will be anathema to the group that will hold you accountable. And usually it's not the government mechanisms for controls. It's usually the relational structures that are operative within that system. So I think it's important to think carefully about those networks of relationships
Hmm.
that will make the system work. Um, because like Philippines, we have all the laws, we have all the procurement systems, we have all the things that we have appropriated from the West. I remember Joy talking about this, but it doesn't work
Mhm.
because the cultural context requires something else. It has to be backed up by a context of relationships.
Yeah.
In other words, it's always easy to do things with a friend.
Yeah.
And I say that it's one of those things that we really need to cultivate. Always try to make friends in all of those agencies so that things actually move. Because that's what the culture is. People don't care very much about these abstract procedures and systems and these rules, but they will respond to somebody who is close to them or their friend or to whom they are accountable.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And we have that a great example in the book of Daniel. He didn't have any friends, but God made him look favorable in the sight of his masters. And maybe we don't have friends that we know, but it comes down to what Joy was saying, is that we need to pray, we need to discern. Is there a person there that can be our advocate? And you see the same story with Joseph. Potiphar looked favorable upon him and gave him the running of the house. And then again, the prison. And sometimes, and I come right back, we think it's impossible, but God can do it. And we have to allow God to do it. And it's just amazing. Even Jesus with the ride on the donkey, on Palm Sunday, he says the master needs him. Oh, here, have my donkey. And so often we forget that we have not because we ask not. And we need to be deliberate in asking God. And the trouble with, if you look at the story of the Israelites coming out of Egypt, it took them so long to ask for God. It's only when they started crying out that God said, okay, now's the time. And we need to cry out and we need to make people aware. We have about 5 minutes. If you haven't put your name, an email address in the chat room, please do so if you're comfortable in doing so. And we'd like to keep this conversation going. And then also, I've given the dates of next Monday. It's on a different link, but next Saturday, there's a continuation of these discussions, but with a business focus at the same time. And there's December 9th, there's the World Anti-Corruption, UN Anti-Corruption Day. And so we have a webinar at that. So thank you for joining us. Anybody would like to make a final comment or prayer for us before we go? And thank you, Joy, for your presentation.
I'm
Thank you
very
also
happy to
for the
pray.
opportunity.
Please go ahead, Alfred.
Yeah. Okay, let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity, an opportunity to reflect on what you are calling us to do in this world. Lord, I thank you for the wisdom, the knowledge, the understanding that we have gained in this particular time. I pray that, Lord, you would continue to encourage us to press on as we fight corruption from a faith perspective. And Lord, whenever the door is opened for us to serve you, give us courage so that we can move on and we can face these challenges. We know the pain that so many people are going through just because of corruption. Lord, I bring to you our needs, I pray that this platform may continue to grow, and the plans that we have, Lord, I pray that they may come to fruition. Thank you for today, and we pray for Monday and other days to come when we meet to deliberate on how we can best serve you through fighting corruption. Lord, once again, thank you, and thank you for the fellowship. In your name I pray. Amen.
And
Amen. Thank you so much.
thank you
Nice
so much.
meeting you.
Thank
Hoping
you.
to see you in next virtual cafe.
Yes.
Thank you. So bye-bye.
Blessings. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.